In a quiet neighborhood in Cayce, South Carolina, a young girl's innocent game turned into a nightmare. 6-year-old Faye Swetlik vanished without a trace, sparking a desperate search that gripped the nation. Her mother, devastated, would never have imagined the terrifying truth that lay just around the corner. Days later, Faye's body was found near her home. But the shocking twist? The man who had helped search for her turned out to be the very person responsible for her death. Coty Scott Taylor, her neighbor, was living a secret life that no one could have ever suspected. How could someone living so close to the victim hide such a dark truth? What happened in those final hours of Faye's life? This case will make you question how well we really know the people around us. Stay with us as we uncover every chilling detail of the Faye Swetlik case and discover what led to this heartbreaking tragedy. Don't forget to subscribe. This is one story you won't want to miss. It was an ordinary Monday afternoon in Cayce, South Carolina. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place. Just a quiet suburban neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else's name. The houses were modest but cozy, surrounded by towering oak trees, and the sound of children playing in the streets was a familiar comfort. Among those children was 6-year-old Faye Swetlik, whose laughter echoed through her small street as she spent the afternoon playing outside. Faye was a sweet, joyful little girl who loved to sing, play with her toys, and spend time with her mother. She had an infectious smile that lit up every room she entered, and her bright blue eyes sparkled with curiosity. That day, she was excited to play outside, one of her favorite activities. She had been running up and down the driveway, her laughter filling the air as her mother, who was inside, kept an eye on her from the window. But by the time the clock struck 3:30 p.m., Faye's playtime would come to an abrupt and terrifying end. When her mother, who had briefly stepped inside the house to grab a drink, returned to the window, Faye was nowhere to be seen. The driveway was empty. The street was quiet. Panic set in. At first, her mother thought Faye might have gone to play with a neighbor, or perhaps wandered a little too far down the street. But as the minutes passed, and then an hour, the sinking feeling in her stomach grew. She called out for her daughter, but there was no answer. Neighbors, friends, and family began to gather on the street, and soon, the search began. Everyone assumed it was just a temporary scare. After all, children sometimes wander off without warning. But as the hours stretched on and there was still no sign of Faye, the situation grew more desperate. At 7 p.m., a missing child report was filed. The authorities responded immediately. Officers and volunteers combed through every inch of the area, knocking on doors, checking the nearby woods, and searching every possible hiding spot a child might wander into. But Faye was nowhere to be found. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. The next morning, the search intensified. Helicopters flew overhead, and K-9 units scoured the dense woods surrounding the neighborhood. Search parties worked in shifts, but the hours turned into days with no leads, no clues, and no answers. The once peaceful town of Cayce was now gripped by fear and confusion. How could a child simply disappear from her own front yard? In the midst of this frantic search, Faye's mother, who had been desperately trying to hold herself together, was beginning to lose hope. The local news stations began covering the case, and as the story spread, people from all over the country reached out, offering their support, and yet the one thing no one could offer was an explanation. What had happened to little Faye Swetlik? And then, on the third day of the search, authorities received the phone call that would send shockwaves through the entire town. A body had been found, but it wasn't just any body. It was Faye's. She was found in a wooded area behind her neighborhood, less than 100 yards from her own home. The discovery was a heart-wrenching blow to the community. What could have happened to her? How could someone take such an innocent life? As the investigators processed the scene, they were left with one chilling question. Who could do this to a child? The answer was one no one could have anticipated. The discovery of Faye Swetlik's body had sent shockwaves through the community of Cayce. The small, tight-knit town, known for its quiet streets and friendly neighbors, was now a place consumed by fear. For the people who knew Faye, the loss was unimaginable. To them, she was more than just a missing child. She was a symbol of innocence, of everything pure in the world. Now that innocence had been brutally stolen, leaving behind only questions and devastation. The police, who had initially been optimistic about finding Faye safe, now faced the grim reality that their worst fears had come true. The investigation had become a homicide case. But there was still so much they didn't know: who had taken Faye and why. The lack of evidence at the scene only deepened the mystery. There were no signs of forced entry at Faye's home, and the wooded area where her body was found was eerily close to where she had been playing. It didn't make sense. As the news spread, the town was flooded with emotions: grief, anger, confusion, and, perhaps most of all, fear. How could something so horrific happen in a place where everyone thought they were safe? Neighbors started looking at each other with suspicion, and families became more protective of their children. No one felt safe anymore, not even the children playing in the yard. For Faye's family, the pain was unbearable. Her mother, who had spent the days since her daughter's disappearance clinging to hope, was now left to face the harsh reality of the situation. Every parent's nightmare had come true. Her world, once filled with light and joy, had been shattered forever. Amidst the sorrow, something more unsettling was happening. The investigation began to shift, as new clues emerged that pointed to something far more sinister than anyone had anticipated. The evidence was starting to reveal a chilling picture. It wasn't just the body that was found. It was the way she was left, the manner of her death. The details were disturbing, and they suggested something personal, something deeply unsettling. As detectives delved deeper into the case, they uncovered unsettling facts about the neighborhood where Faye had lived. The area, which had once seemed so safe, was hiding dark secrets. Faye's neighbor, Coty Scott Taylor, a 30-year-old father who lived just a few doors down, was now under scrutiny. He had been one of the people who helped search for Faye in the hours after she went missing, showing concern and offering support. He was, by all accounts, a quiet and unremarkable man, a man who blended in with everyone else. But as the investigation continued, disturbing details began to surface about Taylor's background. He had a criminal record, though nothing that seemed to explain such a violent act. What's more, there were whispers that Taylor had been acting strangely in the days before Faye's disappearance. Neighbors recalled seeing him lurking around the area more than usual, his behavior becoming more erratic. Yet, the most chilling detail of all was this: Coty Taylor had been one of the last people to see Faye alive. As police worked tirelessly to piece together the timeline of events, they began to focus their efforts on Taylor. The investigation into his past, his movements, and his interactions with Faye grew more intense. The once comforting presence of this seemingly normal neighbor now seemed like a dangerous illusion. With each passing day, the suspicion surrounding Taylor grew. The quiet, unassuming neighbor was no longer just a bystander in this tragedy. He was a prime suspect. And as the community grappled with the shock of this revelation, they were left to wonder: could the person they had trusted the most have been hiding a dark secret all along? The investigation into Faye Swetlik's tragic death was beginning to take a more sinister turn. With Coty Scott Taylor emerging as the prime suspect, law enforcement's focus shifted to understanding more about the man who had once been seen as a quiet, helpful neighbor. Taylor's life, at first glance, appeared unremarkable. A middle-aged man with a history of minor offenses and no immediate criminal connections to the case. But as detectives dug deeper, they began to uncover a much darker side to Taylor. Taylor had lived in the Cayce area for several years, but he wasn't exactly well known by most of his neighbors. He kept to himself, rarely interacted socially, and lived a solitary life with his young daughter, whom he shared custody of. On the surface, he appeared like an ordinary father, perhaps a little aloof but not someone who would raise any suspicions. However, as investigators began to piece together his past, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Coty Scott Taylor had a criminal history. Though not violent, it was enough to raise concerns. He had been arrested in the past for a series of minor offenses: drug possession, theft, and a few altercations that never escalated to anything more serious. Yet, nothing in his past had prepared the community for the terrifying truth that would soon unfold. As police interviews with neighbors and friends of Taylor progressed, it became apparent that there had been certain strange behaviors in the days leading up to Faye's disappearance. Neighbors recalled seeing Taylor lingering around the street more frequently than usual. His presence wasn't overt or loud, but there was something unsettling about the way he watched people. He had been seen peering into the windows of nearby homes, and more than once, people reported hearing him talking to himself in a way that struck them as odd. But there was one thing that made people feel truly uncomfortable. In the days before Faye went missing, Taylor had been seen near the spot where her body was later discovered. He had been walking his dog in the area, which wasn't unusual in itself. But some neighbors recalled him acting oddly that day. His movements were erratic, almost as though he was scouting the area for something or someone. The more detectives learned about Taylor, the more they realized that his past held more than just criminal offenses. It contained a dangerous lack of empathy and a history of odd behavior that painted him in a very different light. His interactions with women, too, seemed to be fraught with tension. Those who knew him described Taylor as socially awkward, unable to connect with others on a basic level, and yet strangely intense when it came to his desire for control. One of the most chilling pieces of evidence came from his work history. Taylor had worked at several low-level jobs, including as a landscaper and a maintenance worker. He had a brief stint working at a nearby grocery store, where his colleagues had recalled unsettling behavior that led to his termination. In particular, several women reported feeling uncomfortable around him due to his attempts to invade their personal space and make unsolicited advances. But it wasn't just his social interactions that were concerning. Police discovered that Coty Scott Taylor had a fascination with true crime, particularly cases involving child victims. Investigators found a disturbing collection of online searches, books, and articles in Taylor's home, all relating to child abductions and murders. This was the final piece of the puzzle for investigators. Taylor had been researching cases that mirrored the very crime he had now committed. As the investigation into Taylor's past unfolded, a horrifying truth emerged. Coty Scott Taylor wasn't just a bystander in Faye's disappearance. He had been actively planning and stalking her for days, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But why Faye? Why this innocent little girl, with her bright smile and love of life? What had motivated Taylor to commit such a horrific act? The answer was still elusive, but one thing was clear. The quiet, unassuming neighbor was not the person he had appeared to be. And as detectives closed in on Taylor, the chilling reality set in. The man who had once been trusted to help search for Faye was now the very person who had stolen her life. As the investigation into Coty Scott Taylor deepened, the tension in the town of Cayce grew unbearable. The community, still reeling from the shock of Faye Swetlik's death, could barely comprehend that the man who had been a part of their lives for years was now the central figure in a chilling murder investigation. But the evidence was mounting, and law enforcement was no longer questioning if Taylor was involved. They were now asking how soon they could bring him to justice. The turning point in the case came when police discovered DNA evidence that directly linked Taylor to Faye's murder. A sample taken from the scene where Faye's body had been found matched Taylor's DNA. Investigators were now certain. Taylor had been the last person to see Faye alive, and the man who had helped search for her was, in fact, the one who had taken her life. The news of Taylor's arrest spread quickly through Cayce, and the community was left in a state of disbelief. How could a man, who had lived so close to Faye, who had been so outwardly concerned about her disappearance, be capable of such an atrocity? The man who had walked among them for years, helping search for a child he had abducted, was now behind bars, facing charges of murder, kidnapping, and child endangerment. When Taylor was finally arrested, his reaction was nothing short of chilling. He showed no emotion, no remorse, and no acknowledgement of the devastation he had caused. The man who had once seemed so ordinary was now revealed to be a predator, a cold and calculating individual who had carefully planned every detail of Faye's abduction and murder. During his interrogation, Taylor refused to speak, remaining silent even as detectives laid out the evidence against him. It was as if he had no intention of explaining his actions, and perhaps he didn't see a need to. His indifference to the pain he had caused was the most disturbing part of the whole ordeal. Faye's family, meanwhile, was struggling to come to terms with the horror that had unfolded. Faye's mother, still in disbelief, could barely comprehend that the person who had played a role in her daughter's disappearance was a neighbor, a man she had trusted, even allowed into her home. The idea that a man who seemed so normal, so helpful, could turn out to be capable of such evil was a nightmare that none of them had ever imagined. The media circus that followed was unrelenting. News outlets descended on Cayce, flooding the town with reporters and cameras. Taylor's mugshot, showing his blank, emotionless expression, was splashed across every news channel. The community was left grappling with the public spectacle of the case, and everyone wanted answers. Why had he done it? What had led him to commit such a brutal and senseless crime? As the days passed, it became clear that Taylor wasn't talking. His defense attorney attempted to delay the trial, citing the need for a psychiatric evaluation, but that only fueled the growing anger among the public. The town was demanding justice, and they wanted it now. The question on everyone's mind was, what had happened in the moments before Faye's life was stolen from her? And would Taylor ever be held accountable for the terrible crime he had committed? Months passed before the court date arrived, and the anticipation in Cayce reached a boiling point. The entire town had been caught in the grip of this unspeakable tragedy, and now the time for justice was finally near. The trial of Coty Scott Taylor was not just a local event. It became a national spectacle. The media swarmed the courthouse, broadcasting every detail, every argument, and every tear shed by Faye's family. The town that had once felt so safe was now under a microscope, its darkest secrets laid bare for the world to see. For Faye's mother, the trial was a painful reminder of the daughter she had lost. Each day, she would sit in the courtroom, her face stoic yet broken, as the evidence was presented. The images of her daughter's final moments, pictures of the crime scene, video footage, and audio recordings of Taylor's chilling silence during his interrogation, flashed on screens in front of her. Every piece of evidence felt like a knife to the heart. How could someone who had once been trusted to help find her child be the one who had taken her life? The prosecution's case was clear. Taylor had stalked Faye for days before abducting her. They presented the overwhelming DNA evidence, the witness testimonies, and the troubling history of Taylor's behavior. The prosecution painted a portrait of a man who had been hiding in plain sight, carefully studying his victim and waiting for the perfect opportunity. The case against him was undeniable. The jury, composed of people from the local community and nearby towns, listened intently as the details of the crime unfolded. Faye's family sat through every moment of the trial, bracing themselves for the gut-wrenching facts that were laid bare in the courtroom. But the hardest part came when the defense attempted to introduce doubt. They argued that Taylor had been suffering from a mental illness, suggesting that his actions had been driven by some form of psychological breakdown. But this argument felt hollow to those who had known Faye and her family. No explanation, no matter how tragic or complex, could justify the brutal murder of an innocent child. The defense's attempts to humanize Taylor only made him appear more monstrous to the people who had trusted him, and the jury wasn't swayed. During the trial, it became evident that Taylor had no intention of offering an explanation or apology. He sat silently throughout the proceedings, his eyes cold and distant. There were no tears, no moments of remorse. The prosecution's witness testimony, including that of forensic experts, painted a clear picture of how Faye had been taken and murdered. The question now was what motivated Taylor to do it. Had it been a random act of violence? Or was it something more premeditated, a deep-seated desire for control and power? As the days of the trial dragged on, Faye's family and the people of Cayce grew more frustrated with the slow pace of the justice system. The courtroom was packed every day, with spectators and supporters of the Swetlik family filling the seats, waiting for a moment of reckoning. The trial was a battle of wills, one side fighting for the truth to be known, the other desperately trying to defend a man who seemed beyond redemption. Finally, after days of testimony, the jury deliberated. The tension in the air was thick, as the people of Cayce anxiously awaited the verdict. What would justice look like for little Faye? Would the man who had taken her life face the punishment he deserved? The decision came down with thunderous finality. Coty Scott Taylor was found guilty of the kidnapping, murder, and abuse of Faye Swetlik. The courtroom erupted in mixed emotions: relief, anger, and a sense of deep, heartbreaking closure. Taylor was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never walk free again. But even as the gavel came down, the town of Cayce knew that justice would never truly erase the pain of Faye's loss. The scars would remain forever, etched in the memories of those who had known her, and in the hearts of her grieving family. The courtroom's gavel had struck, and with it, the life of Coty Scott Taylor was irrevocably altered. The people of Cayce, once a tight-knit, trusting community, were left in a state of uneasy peace. Justice had been served, but the scars remained, both in the hearts of those who had lost Faye, and in the community that would forever be haunted by what had occurred. Faye's family, despite the verdict, struggled to find peace. The trial had been a long and agonizing process, each day bringing fresh waves of grief. But the conviction of Taylor, while necessary, had not brought back Faye. No amount of justice, no matter how severe, could restore the vibrant life that had been taken so senselessly. Faye's mother, still reeling from the trauma of losing her daughter in such a brutal manner, found solace only in the memories of her child's bright smile and infectious laughter. It was those fleeting moments of happiness that she clung to now, as a painful reminder of what was lost. The community of Cayce, too, was irrevocably changed. Neighbors who had once felt safe and secure now lived in a heightened sense of caution. Children, once allowed to play outside without fear, were now watched carefully by parents, who feared that the unimaginable could happen again. Trust, which had once been given freely to those who lived nearby, now felt like a commodity, something fragile and easily broken. The media frenzy had long since died down, but the damage remained. Cayce, South Carolina, had become a symbol of grief and loss for the nation. News outlets had followed every twist and turn of the case, but for those living in this small town, it was more than just a story. It was their reality. Faye's funeral had been attended by hundreds. It was a heartbreaking sight to see the little girl, whose life had been cut so short, laid to rest. Her family, friends, and the community gathered to mourn, to remember, and to say goodbye. The service was filled with tributes, songs, and tears, as those who knew her best reflected on her joyful spirit, her curiosity, and the love she had brought into their lives. In the months that followed, Faye's mother became an advocate for children's safety, speaking at community events and working with organizations dedicated to preventing child abduction. Though her pain would never fully go away, she found some semblance of purpose in honoring her daughter's memory. Her journey was not one of forgetting, but one of remembering, of keeping Faye's spirit alive in every word spoken, every event attended, and every life touched by the tragedy. Coty Scott Taylor, meanwhile, faced his life sentence with cold indifference. He was sent to a maximum security prison, where he would live out the rest of his days. He never showed any remorse for his actions. His silence during the trial had been a chilling reflection of his complete lack of empathy. But as he sat in his cell, surrounded by the walls that would contain him for the rest of his life, the community of Cayce could only wonder, what drove him to commit such a horrific act? Was there something in his past that had twisted him into the monster he had become? The answers, it seemed, would never come. The legacy of Faye Swetlik was one of heartbreak, but also of resilience. Her story, which had begun with innocent play and ended in tragedy, would never be forgotten. As time passed, the town slowly began to heal, though the scars would remain forever. The community learned a painful lesson: that evil can exist in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the people you trust the most can hide the darkest secrets. As for Faye's family, they would continue to live with the pain of their loss, but they would also carry forward the memory of a little girl whose life had been stolen too soon. They would honor her by ensuring that her story was never forgotten, and that her legacy would live on in the hearts of those who knew and loved her. The story of Faye Swetlik, though tragic, would continue to remind the world of the importance of vigilance, the value of community, and the power of love in the face of unimaginable loss. For as long as her name was spoken, her spirit would endure, forever a light in the darkness. If you found this video insightful and would like to see more content like this, consider subscribing to the channel. We'd also appreciate hearing your thoughts. Feel free to share your comments below. Your feedback helps us continue to bring valuable content to you.